Let me tell you about Dr. Houle. Christian, can I just call you Christian?
Yeah, that's fine.
Christian grew up in Canada, in Ottawa, I think. He's French-Canadian. He's going to talk slowly for us. He's an associate professor of political science at Michigan State University, where he joined the department in 2013. Prior to that, he was assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Trinity College Dublin for 3 years. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Rochester in 2011 and his MA in economics from Queen's University, Ontario, Canada in 2004. His main research and teaching interests focus on the comparative politics of developing countries. He is especially interested in topics related to democracy, regime change, inequality, political instability, and civil war. So, take it away, Christian. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for coming to the presentation. And thank you also for the invitation. So as was just said, I work mostly on comparative politics. So not on the US per se. I will try to make sure that the talk is relevant to the US as much as possible. So I will say that I work a lot also on quantitative analysis. So I will use a bit of statistics on during the talk. I don't really work on any region in particular. I work more on topics. So can you hear me now? I will try to speak as loud as I can. Okay. So I work more on specific topics, and one of the topics I work on a lot is democratization, so regime change, and the role of inequality. Okay. So that's what the talk is going to be on today. So basically, the world is currently experiencing a wave of democratic erosion. Okay, so many countries around the world are becoming less and less democratic. Among them, the US is usually counted as one country that has experienced an important democratic erosion recently. Other countries will include India, Hungary, Brazil, so many countries around the world. And what is special here is that many of these countries, especially the US, were usually thought as being highly robust democracies. So not democracies that we should expect that will experience some kind of democratic erosion. So in this presentation, we will look at how inequality affects democracy. And in particular, I will focus on a specific angle through which inequality could affect democracy. So there are different ways we could study that question. Here I will focus on one specific angle just because of time constraints. So here I will look at what is called democratic backsliding. Okay, so it's a way in which inequality could affect democracy. And democratic backsliding, we're going to go through it in more detail later on during the presentation. But what it means is basically the erosion in democratic institutions driven by democratically elected chief executive. So here it could be the president or the prime minister. And if we look at all of these cases of democratic erosion, these are all examples of democratic backsliding. So all cases in which the president or the prime minister is the one that has attacked the democratic institutions in all of these cases. So that's what we're going to focus on in the talk. Okay, so what I will argue is that inequality increases the likelihood that a democracy experiences democratic backsliding. And this is basically in two ways. The first way is that it increases the probability that political leaders with weak commitment to democracy get elected in the first place. And second, that it increases their capacity to concentrate power once they are in office. Okay? So in terms of the outline of the talk, what I will do first is that I will go through basically just a description of the level of inequality in the US and how it compares with other countries around the world. Then we will briefly define what we mean by democracy and also democratic backsliding. Then I will go through the argument on the relationship between inequality and democratic backsliding. And finally, we're going to provide some empirical evidence. Okay. So first, in terms of how unequal the US is. So the measure I will use here is the Gini coefficient. This is the most widely used measure in the literature. Okay, so the measure that is used the most and for which we have the most observation. Unfortunately, it's also a measure that is very difficult to interpret. Okay, so it gives you a number between 0 and 100, and it's hard to interpret exactly what 50 will mean, for example. Okay? But 0, in that case, will mean a country in which everybody in the society has exactly the same income. 100 will mean a country in which one person has the whole income of the country. Of course, no country has a 0 or 100. Okay, so There's no countries like that. So all countries are in the middle, and a higher number will indicate a higher level of inequality in that country. Okay? So when we think of inequality, it's important to distinguish between two forms of inequality. Okay? So first, there is what we will call the market inequality, or here the market Gini coefficient. So this is the level of inequality before tax and distribution has taken place, okay? Before taxation and distribution. So this is the level of inequality really driven by the market, so by the market economy, so how much inequality there is before we have distribution. Then the second type of inequality we're going to look at is the net inequality, so net Gini coefficient here because we're using the Gini coefficient. So this is inequality after taxation and distribution. Okay? So this is a result both of the market and of distribution. Okay? So typically in most countries, although that's not always the case, the net inequality should be lower than the market inequality. Okay? And we will see that when we compare the US with other countries, the comparison is different depending on what measure we use here. Okay? So here, this is in this graph, what it shows is the level of market inequality, so the market Gini coefficient, in the US, okay, so this is only the US, between 1970 and 2020. Okay? So what we see clearly here is that inequality has really increased in the US, especially since the late 70s and early 80s. Okay? Inequality has been increasing continuously in the US since then. Okay? So this again is market inequality, okay, before taxation and distribution. Now we will compare the US with other countries around the world. So first we'll start with just looking at all countries. If we take the average level of inequality in all countries around the world. Okay? And this is the line in red. So the US is in black, other countries are in red. So what we see is that although in the 70s, so before the 80s, the US was actually slightly more equal than other countries around the world, it became more unequal, and the gap is increasing since the 80s. Okay? It may be a bit unfair to compare the US with all other countries around the world because among them there are some very poor countries and often in very poor countries you will have a very low level of inequality, okay? Because they are pre-industrial. So, sorry? It perhaps makes more sense to compare the US with other developed countries, or other Western countries. So that's what we're going to do next. Okay? So the blue line is other Western countries. So here, Western countries, it's the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Western Europe. Okay? And what we see is that in other Western countries, inequality also increased since the 1980s. The US is somewhat more unequal, but the difference is not huge, okay, between the US and other Western countries in terms of market inequality. As we will see, the difference will be very large when we look at net inequality. Okay? Also here, I compare the US, so the US is in black, again, with two other countries. Okay? So the first one in orange, this is Sweden. Okay? The reason why I take Sweden is because it's often thought to be a highly equal country. Okay? So I use Sweden. And as you can see, so again, here in orange, the US is more equal than Sweden, but there's not a big difference in market inequality. Okay? In green, I take Canada. I use Canada because it's our neighbor and because I'm from there, I guess. So as you can see, also the US is more unequal, but the gap is not huge other than, let's say, more recently. And what you can see also, both in Canada and in Sweden, you have that inequality increase since the 1980s. Okay? So you have the same kind of general trend. Okay? So here there's not a huge difference. But it will be a bigger difference when we will look at net inequality. Okay? So now I redo, not the last graph, but the graph before, where I compare the US with other countries around the world and other Western countries. So here in black, so first if we just look at that line, so this is the US. So again, we see that net inequality, so inequality after taxation and distribution, has also increased in the US since the 1980s. Okay, so it clearly increased since then. Then if we compare with the rest of the world, the US is actually slightly more equal or about the same. And this is not necessarily surprising because in many developing countries, the state is relatively weak. They don't have the capacity to redistribute to the same extent as a country like the US does. So there's not a big difference between net and market inequality. Also, often they will have different regime types. For example, if they have more an autocracy, in which they don't have the same incentive to redistribute toward them. Okay, so But what is really interesting is when we compare with other Western countries, okay, that have similar economies, similar capacity to redistribute, and a similar regime type. And what we see is that here, other Western countries have a way lower level of net inequality. Okay? And that even here, if we look, we don't really see an upward trend since 1980. So other Western countries, even though the market inequality increased since 1980s, they have compensated for that using redistribution. Okay? Whereas the US has not, to the same extent. Okay? Also here, if we compare the US with, again, with Canada and Sweden, what we see is that although the US and Sweden were about the same in terms of market inequality, you have that Sweden basically, here there's a huge gap between the US and Sweden. Okay, and also with Canada to a lesser extent. So in Sweden, even though in inequality, the market inequality is very high, they do redistribute a lot, so that reduces inequality. And that's the reason why we believe usually that Sweden is an equal country, okay? Because of redistribution. Okay, so there are three main takeaway points, I think, from these figures. So the first one is that market and net inequality in the US has increased a lot since 1980s. The second one is that market inequality in the US and other Western countries is very similar. Okay, the US is a bit more unequal, but the difference is negligible. And the third point is that net inequality is much higher in the US than in other Western countries. And so the big difference between the US and other Western countries, it's not the market, it's the level of distribution. It's just that there's less distribution in the US and in other Western countries. Okay? Also another difference between the US and other Western countries, and here I will not provide statistics, although I could have, it's just because of time constraint, is that a large part of inequality in the US is driven by between group inequality. And here I will go into more detail about what I mean by between group inequality. But there are two types of between group inequality that are particularly important in the US. The first type is what we call horizontal inequality. Okay? Horizontal inequality is inequality between culturally defined groups. Okay? So it could be inequality between racial groups, so people from different races, or people from different language if you go in a country like the
Recording
like
stopped.
Okay? So so horizontal inequality is inequality between culturally defined groups. And it has been shown in the literature to be particularly harmful to democracy. We will not go into too much detail on that, again, because of time constraint, but I can during the Q&A. The second type of between group inequality that we see also in the US is inequality between large urban areas and areas dependent on the manufacturing sector. Okay? And this is a type of inequality that we see increase since the 1980s, and that has been driven to a large extent by globalization and automation. And this has been visible in terms of market inequality in all Western countries, or most Western countries, but the most Western countries were able to redistribute in order to compensate for it. So still reduce the level of net inequality. Okay? And that type of inequality has been associated with the rise of anti-democratic populist parties. Okay? Not only in the US, so through the Western world. Okay, so now, before we look at the effect of inequality on democracy, we need to define what democracy is. And different authors will have different definition of what democracy is. Here I just give you my own conception of it. Okay? So I see it as having two different components. The first one is that those that govern are selected through free and fair election, and that's what most people will think of when they think of democracy. And here, those that govern will be the executive and the legislature. Okay? And the second component is that there are also individual rights in a democracy, and also executive constraints. Okay, so democracy is not only about how you take power, but also how you can exercise power. So, for example, there will be an independent judiciary that will constrain the executive. So there are these two key components. And so there are three different angles from which we could look at the effect of inequality on democracy. Okay? The first one, and the one that people have looked the most at in the literature, is on democratic breakdown. So the breakdown of democracy itself, often through military coups. And actually, most of my work is on that question. I will not discuss it in the rest of the talk, just because I don't think military coups are really relevant necessarily to the US, but I can discuss it more during the Q&A. What people find is that inequality is increased likelihood of democratic breakdown. Okay? The second angle will be something about democratic quality. Okay, so it's not really a change whether the country becomes less or more democratic, but things like whether policymakers represent the preference really of the population. And here again, it has been found that inequality reduces the extent to which democracy represents people, just in the sense that if there's a lot of inequality, for example, the rich have more influence over policies because they have more resource, for example, through lobbyism in order to influence policy. Okay. Again, I can discuss that during the Q&A. So what we're going to focus on is democratic backsliding. Again, democratic backsliding is a gradual delimitation of democratic institutions by democratically elected chief executive. Okay? And this is now the dominant way in which we have democratic erosion right now. So all the examples I had in the first slide, India, the US, Brazil, are all cases here. Okay? And that may or may not lead to the full breakdown of democracy. In about 80% of the case, it does. In about 80% of the case, a democratic backsliding will lead to the full breakdown of democracy. It's typically driven by populist leaders. So here, I won't really have the time to go into detail about what is populism. But populism, there's two key factors we need to remember for the rest of the talk. The first one is that it's anti-elite. They use anti-elite rhetoric, anti-mainstream. The second aspect is that they attack the second component of democracy, so individual rights and executive constraints. Okay? So for example, if we think about left-wing populists, they can attack something like property rights. Okay? Right-wing, they can attack individual rights, for example, for immigrants. Okay? So they attack the second part of the component of democracy, mostly. Okay? So here I will make the argument that inequality increases the likelihood that a country experiences backsliding, and really through two different ways. So first, inequality increases the likelihood that political leaders with weak commitment to democracy attain power, and second, makes it easier for them to concentrate power once they are in office. Okay. So first, if I will look at the first part of the argument, so what is the effect of inequality on support for populism? Here there are two big literature on the topic. One that is a bit older and one that is more recent. Okay? So the most early studies focus more on left-wing populist parties, okay? Instead of right-wing populist parties. And here the argument is that inequality widens the gap in preferences of the poor and the rich over redistributive policies. Okay? So you will have that when inequality increases, the poor want more redistribution, and when inequality increases, the rich want less redistribution. Okay, because they are the one that will pay for it. Okay? And at the same time, we have that democracies have often failed to redistribute toward the poor. Okay? There are different reasons for that. So when we look into the data, democracy don't necessarily redistribute way more than autocracies at the same level of development. Okay? Some reason could be just because inequality increases the resource of the rich. So if you have a very unequal democracy, the rich will be able to influence policies, again, to something like lobbyism in order to prevent redistribution. And also democracies involve institutional constraints that reduce the capacity to redistribute. Okay, so for example, there are property rights in a democracy, there's an independent judiciary, the government cannot just take the wealth of the rich and give it to the poor. Okay, people have rights, you cannot just take the wealth of people. Okay? So here, inequality can create incentive for the poor to vote for left-wing populist parties, which can promise to weaken political institutions, so to weaken constraints and individual rights in order to redistribute toward the poor. Okay? And here, the famous example that is always given is that of Venezuela under Chavez. Okay? So this is the example that is given for that kind of mechanism. The problem with this is that most recent cases of democratic backsliding have been driven more by right-wing populism. Okay, so if we think of the US, Poland, Hungary, India, Turkey, Brazil, and the Philippines, these are all cases of right-wing populists that led to democratic backsliding. Okay. So there's also a more recent literature that has shown that inequality can also help the rise of populism in general, including right-wing populism, okay, not only left-wing populism. And here the idea is that inequality creates resentment among the poor, which render them more susceptible to the anti-elite rhetoric of populist parties. Yeah. So in Western countries, resentment is strongest in areas dependent on the manufacturing sector. So, and again, these are the areas that have been affected mostly by globalization and automation. And the resentment is often in these areas, especially strong among members of traditionally dominant group, like in the case of the US will be white people. So there's a lot of evidence here that suggests that this is indeed the case. So evidence will suggest that inequality reduces support for democracy in general. So, and here the idea is that if people don't support democracy, they are more likely to vote for parties that are hostile to democracy. Also, inequality is associated with the adoption of authoritarian values among the poorest people. Here, when you think of authoritarian values, it's things like being intolerant, or it could be believing in strict hierarchies. And these type of values predict support for populism. And there's also more direct evidence that shows that when there's more inequality, people are more likely to vote for populist parties. And both for the left, both on the left and on the right. And then if we look at the second part of the argument, so the second part is that inequality will also make it easier for incumbents to concentrate power. Here, the idea is that inequality will reduce the capacity of the population and opposition party to constrain the incumbent. Okay? In terms of the population, inequality tends to reduce participation, political participation, and political engagement. Okay? So getting informed and participating in political activities requires some resources, and if there's more inequality, the poor are poorer, and so they have less resources. And then being political, so people that are not interested in politics are less likely to have the capacity to constrain the incumbent. So, for example, if you have that the president or prime minister is concentrating power and doing democratic backsliding, people can go into the street and do a demonstration, but if they are not interested in politics, they are not going to do it to the same extent. Yeah. The second part is that inequality also reduces the capacity of opposition parties to constrain the incumbent. Here, unfortunately, I won't have the time to go through that part during the presentation. I can do so during the Q&A, but what is really important here is that especially between group inequality will have that kind of effect. So here it's more between group inequality that is important for why opposition parties will not be able to constrain the incumbent. Okay? And again, I can go through the logic during the Q&A. So. Finally, I'm just going to provide some empirical evidence that this is indeed the case. So that basically we have that when there's more inequality in a country, we're more likely to have democratic backsliding. So here, what I'm going to show is basically the results of a statistical analysis I did for a book chapter that I submitted about 2 weeks ago. Okay, so this is just taken from something I just submitted. And so basically, I estimate the effect of net inequality on the likelihood that a democracy experience a democratic backsliding episode. So it starts democratic backsliding episode. Here I control for many variables. I'm not going to explain that, but it should be interpreted as a way that if everything else is constant and you just change inequality, by how much that will change the probability of democratic backsliding. Okay, so everything else is constant. Okay. The analysis covers more than 90 democracies between 1960 and 2020. And so here are the results. Okay. So we have here the net Gini coefficient, okay, so the net inequality. Here we have the probability of experiencing a democratic backsliding episode. And this is just the onset, so it's a probability that it happens. Okay? And here we have clearly that the probability increases with inequality. Okay? And actually, if you are very unequal countries, your likelihood are extremely high, like 0.25 per year. So it means 25% per year. It's extremely high, the likelihood of democratic backsliding. And there are countries here. So countries like Brazil, South Africa, Malawi, Ecuador, Bolivia are countries that are here. And many of these countries did experience democratic backsliding. So just to illustrate the magnitude of the effect, if we come back to the US and other Western countries, if we plug here the level of inequality of an average Western country, the likelihood that they experience backsliding in a given year is 0.6%. So less than 1%. The US will be 2.3%. So it's about 3 times as large. And this is every year. So if you look over a long time period, that really increases the likelihood of democratic backsliding. Okay? So basically, just to recap the main points we went through. The first, inequality has increased in the US since the 1980s. The difference in inequality between the US and other countries is mainly because of net inequality, so just the US has less distribution than other Western countries. It's not really market driven. Third, there's inequality between groups is especially large in the US, so inequality between, let's say, ethnic groups, and also inequality in terms of different areas that are dependent on different sectors of the economy. Fourth, inequality fosters democratic backsliding, both because it encourages some segment of the population to vote for the anti-democratic populist parties, and also because it weakens the capacity of the population and opposition party to constrain the executive. And finally, provided some empirical evidence to support that. Okay? So again, so thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
So if you write your questions and maybe pass them towards the middle, that might be the best way to do this. But while you're doing that, I had a couple of questions. You talked about sorry, I was a math teacher, so this question comes from there. You talked about this probability increasing every year on the very last slide. Is that like compounding? Is that what you're talking about? So if it's a 2.6% increase every year, you're talking about, we're not just adding that, right?
No, it's just that, so here the model is per year. So if the difference is, so, and of course, so the way I interpreted it is as if years were independent on one another, which is not the case. Of course, it's just that if one country has a 2.3% chance per year and the other country 0.6%, and you look at over 50 years, that should make the country a country that has 2.3% per year way more likely than the one with 0.6% per year. But it's not that it's
not growing.
It's not that the percentage itself is growing. No.
Okay.
It's just that since it's every year, so the model was about the poverty per year, and you look over 50 years, it's way larger in one country than in the other.
And another question I came up with was Nicaragua's been in the news recently. Where does Nicaragua fit in this? Because that was a left-wing populist leader.
Yeah, so Nicaragua is a case of a very unequal country. So if we go back here, let's see. So Nicaragua will be around here in terms of inequality, between 50 and 55. So extremely high. And so it will fit in terms of, I guess, of the first argument that I made about how inequality can lead to left-wing populists. And so we see a lot of left-wing populists in Latin America. So here I just gave the example of Venezuela, but there are many others. And here the argument is often made about inequality in Latin America. So Latin America is the most unequal region in the world, and that's where we see a lot of left-wing populists. So it could be related with the first argument of the earlier literature about how inequality affects preferences over redistribution. So in that way.
And then I have one more question before I turn this over to other people. 1980 seems to have been one moment in time when something stark happened. Mm-hmm. And then there was another dip, though, where in the net Gini, there was a net Gini index dipped for all countries at 2015. So there's like two inflection points in your curves there that looked like they needed contextual explanation. What's happening? See that green one?
Oh yeah, but this is Canada.
COVID.
So I don't. It didn't really decrease that much in the U.S.
Looks like 215.
Yeah, 215.
That looks like COVID to me.
Yeah, I think COVID will be more clear because it's really 2015. But this is only Canada, though. If we look at the world, let's say the world in Western countries, we don't really see that dip in 19.
Where's the net? Not the market,
the net,
but the net.
Let's see.
Right,
Net.
so where's that?
So I think in the US, and so here it will be closer for COVID. I mean, such a small change. It's not way smaller than this one here. I mean, it could be just an increase in redistribution or something along that line.
Right, that's what's happening on that red graph there. All countries, we've got a sudden plunge about 2015.
Yeah, so here I'm not exactly sure why it's all countries, so it depends on the structure of different.
Okay. In 1980, we know what happened in 1980 in this country.
Yeah.
Same in other countries, the same kind of change in political stance.
Yeah.
Maybe
yeah.
I just noticed 1980 on our graph, but 1980 seems to be the kick, at least for our graph.
Yeah. So yeah, more right-wing, so economic policies, but also more free trade and so globalization and automation. That's usually the time in which it's seen as having affected inequality.
Okay, so we've got some other questions from this side of the room. Your thoughts on factors that affect democracy? Gerrymandering, religious beliefs such as evangelicals in the US. Thoughts on connecting those?
Yeah, so gerrymandering is extremely important. It's a way in which that basically democratic backsliding can occur. So if you use gerrymandering in order, and it was actually related with the discussion that I skipped on opposition parties, that's just a way in which you can remain democratic but make the regime less democratic. So it's actually a tool of basically for democratic backsliding. And what was the second part of the question on religious?
Religious beliefs. Can we connect those at all?
With democracy, yes, there's a lot of literature on the link between democracy and religion. Typically, the point that is made in the literature is that religion tend to have a negative effect on democracy, but it's really in some contexts. Often these are based more on early case of democratization, like in the West, and we have seen often in these countries that as countries have become richer, people became less religious, and that has had a positive effect on democracy. But in terms of causal relationship, it's a bit difficult to. And if you were to do a statistical analysis with religion as a variable, it has virtually no effect on democracy. You know, people will often think that some specific religion are not good for democracy, but if you include them in a model and you control for other stuff, religion doesn't seem to be extremely important, statistically speaking. In some cases, it may be important.
Two of these questions are sort of related. It said it'd be interesting to overlay a timeline of different presidents on the Gini graph. And the other one that relates to that was Reagan. Did the Reagan administration, would that be a significant point on that graph?
1980.
Yeah. Well, think so?
Because I'm young, I was in high school, or actually not even high school in the 80s, can you tell me what happened in the 80s so that I understand for sure that I know what we're talking about? Because I was in junior high, so figure out,
Okay.
so that I make sure I know what we're
Yeah,
talking about.
good. That's a good reminder for the rest of us, though. So what happened in the 1980s? Anyone else want to speak to that? Yes.
Technology boom.
Okay.
Technology boom was one thing. What
That
else
was
happened
90.
in the 1980s?
90.
Ronald
Reagan was
came to
elected.
power.
Deregulation.
Deregulation.
Oh, yeah.
Anything else happened in the 1980s? Are we helping?
Yeah.
Change in taxing
Change in taxes.
would create more inequality.
Cold War.
Okay. Didn't we have quite a bit of inflation at some point?
Well, inflation was a little earlier than that. Our big inflation was a little earlier than that.
I think companies started moving their manufacturing overseas.
I'm sorry?
I think companies were moving their manufacturing overseas.
Companies, so the beginning of globalization with companies starting to what do you call it?
Thank you.
When you move your manufacturing base overseas.
Offshore.
I can't imagine. I'm sorry, that's just terrible that I didn't even think of that. Okay, so back to the questions again. This one says, why does inequality lead to populism? You've shown that it does, that you can correlate it there, but why? What makes groups from lower income groups lean towards populist leaders?
Yeah, so in terms of, so there were the two arguments. There were basically the one about distribution, more for left-wing populism. The second one will be more about, and it's a bit harder so it creates more resentment. So the thing is that populist parties are really parties that are anti-establishment, elite, and it gives some opportunities to these parties to be able to appeal to the people that already don't like really the elite because of the high level of inequality. And here we think mostly about inequality between what will be perceived by them as being the elite and themselves. So, for example, it could be people living in big cities. That could be the elite that they are taking about. But it gives some kind of opportunity for them to build that kind of political basis. And if we think of the left, that will be the top 1%. So basically, if we think of left-wing populists, it's usually the top 1% that controls everything. And basically, we need a government in order to tax them and have a fairer distribution of income. And here, the reason why it's populism that is important is that populists want usually to, well, it's part of the definition of populism, they want to reduce constraints on the executive. In order to do that, you need to have a system in which is little constraint on the executive, and they also want to reduce individual rights. So, for example, if you're a left-wing populist, you want to reduce property rights because you cannot distribute without if you don't violate in some way property rights. You cannot distribute, do large-scale distribution. So that's the reason why it helps populist parties.
It's finding who the populist leader manages to find the person or the group to blame.
Yeah.
And then directs the attention in that way. How are opposition parties weakened by inequality? That was something that you put on there.
Yeah, I can go back to. Yeah, I went fast. Just when I was practicing, I was way above the time, so I went through. I decided to skip that part. Okay. Let's see. Yeah. So inequality. So here the argument again is reduces the capacity of opposition party to constrain the incumbent. One way usually that we have modeled or try to understand why some parties will, when they are in power, they don't try to concentrate power is because they are scared that once they leave office, that the opposition is going to do the same thing. Okay, so it's basically a logic of deterrence. Okay, so if one party, once it is in power, tries to take all the power and basically reduce the power of the legislature, for example, or judiciary, then when the other party is in power, they will be able to do the same thing. So they just deter each other. Okay, the problem, though, is that between group inequality will tend to homogenize the political basis of the voters of each group. So if we think, for example, of inequality between large cities and more areas dependent on the manufacturing sector. What will happen when there's more inequality between them? Large cities will tend all to vote for the same party, which is the case in the US for the Democratic Party, and the areas that are dependent on the manufacturing sector will tend to vote for the other party, so the Republican Party, because there's more inequality between them. Okay? And also the same with between group inequality in the sense for ethnic groups, because in the same way that we have also in the US, race can really help know who will vote for which group. And so that will render some party more vulnerable to electoral distortion than others. So for example, if you want to do gerrymandering, it's way easier to do it against urban areas and against rural areas. Mm-hmm. Okay? And so if everybody in urban areas vote for one party, then you can use gerrymandering against them, but then that party cannot threaten you to do the same. Okay, so it reduces the capacity to deter other parties from doing the same thing. Okay? The same thing also for things like voter ID law, for example. That's been shown to affect way more minorities more than members that are not people that are not members of minority. And so if minorities all vote for one party, then that party is way more vulnerable than the other one, and that party cannot threaten the other party from doing the same in the future. Okay, so between group inequality, so here I give the example, urban areas and minority voters are more vulnerable to gerrymandering and voter restriction laws. In the case of the US, but that's what between group inequality does. It does that basically it could be in a situation in which people that are vulnerable to this kind of electoral distortion are all in the same party, in which case that party cannot threaten the other party from doing the same thing. So all that logic of deterrence disappears. Okay. I hope that makes sense.
So someone here is pointing out emphasizing the difference between the market Gini index and the net Gini index, that lower taxes which in this country, I think, are often what a party pushes forward. We're going to lower somebody's taxes. So this person is proposing lower taxes for the wealthy causes higher net inequality.
Yeah, and that's what basically is one of the explanation for the difference between the two in the US compared with other countries.
Okay, this was a very local question. Do you think it would make a difference in Michigan to move from a flat income tax to a progressive income tax?
Yeah, so if you have a flat income tax, it's less, because it's less progressive, it will tend to make the net Gini higher. Okay? So if you have a progressive taxation system, then it will tend to reduce the net Gini coefficient, or the net inequality, no matter what measure you use. Okay, so yeah, so a proportional income tax will tend to increase inequality, but only net inequality.
And this one goes back to an earlier question talking about technology, the growth of technology in the 80s. That was also, as I think it was Barb pointed out, that's when people started exporting their businesses overseas as well, manufacturing overseas, and then selling it back to us. So are those two factors, that growth of technology and the, what's the word, guys, for when
Offshoring.
Thank you. When you outsource your business, have those been responsible for growth
Yeah.
of inequality in other countries as well as ours?
Yeah, in most Western countries, and that's the reason why you see in the 80s, in basically all Western countries, you see an increase in market inequality in these Western countries. Yeah.
Could you comment on the creation of democracy as a comment on the creation of democracy as a result of inequality? That is the pushback to inequality creating democracy. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. So actually, there's a lot of literature on that, and I mentioned beginning. So when we look at the different ways we could look at the effect of inequality on democracy, regime change is, so there's a huge literature on that. Typically, we don't find a strong statistical relationship between inequality and the likelihood of democratization. But here there are different things at play. So you can think that when inequality is higher, people will demand democracy more, because then you can use the regime in order to redistribute towards yourself. Okay, so that people can have a pushback, they can be dissatisfied with autocracy if inequality is very high. But at the same time, democracy almost never happens just because the population takes power. Usually democratization is, people can go into the street, demand democracy, but in the end, the autocrat agrees to have democratization, or dies, and then the people that are succeeding him will decide to democratize or not. And the idea is that when inequality is very high, it means also that the autocrat, or at least the ruling elite, has a lot to lose from democratization, all because of the logic of redistribution that we had discussed earlier. So that it has these two different effects. It may increase demand for democracy, but it reduces willingness to supply it. So that the net effect, at least statistically, is ambiguous. We don't have a strong relationship between inequality and the likelihood of democratization. Only between inequality and whether democracy survives.
Okay.
So it's only in that sense.
What drives market inequality? Is it dependent on the type of government?
Yeah, but it would depend a lot on the type of economy you have. So for example, if you have an economy that is dependent on just, let's say, subsistence farmers. So I mentioned that often poor countries have a fairly low level of market inequality. These countries will tend to be very equal. Okay? So most people are relatively poor. They have a small piece of land. So these countries will tend to have a very low level of inequality. There's also things like so basically the kind of factor endowments you have, the kind of economy you have. Often those that are based, let's say, economies that are based on things like large plantation will tend to remain, to be very unequal. And what is very interesting with market inequality is that if we were to rank in 1960 or any date in the past, countries about from high to low in terms of market inequality, and we do it today, it will be basically the same ranking. We may change a few rank for some countries, but it's not something that's changed a lot, market inequality. It tends to be dependent on things related to basically the basic structure of the economy. It could change if you have, let's say, more, if you were an agricultural country and you start to industrialize, but it doesn't tend to change much. It changes more within country itself. So there's not big difference across, but yeah.
So, back to your idea of this between group inequality.
Yeah.
Can you describe some of the groups that you're thinking about there that would be unequal when you say between group inequality?
Okay, go back. Let's see. Okay, so which was that?
So
Okay, so the first one, horizontal inequality is inequality between cultural group. And what a cultural group is dependent on the context of that country. So if we think, for example, in the US, usually the way this is conceived is inequality between racial group. Okay, so what is a group? Could be white people, African American, Native American. That's what usually we will believe in to be horizontal inequality in the context of the US. So if you take the average income of people that are white and average income of people that are African American, the difference between the two will be the horizontal inequality in that context. If you go in another country, like in Canada, what is relevant is language. Okay, so language group is what is politically relevant. It's not really racial groups. And so in that case will be the difference between the average income of French speakers and average income of English speakers. That will be horizontal.
And this is the kind of democracy, this is the kind of inequality that is most harmful.
It's more harmful than, let's say, inequality than inequality within ethnic groups. It has been found to be more harmful because both statistically and also in terms of argument. That's what people are encouraged.
The reason I'm asking this is because the question here is, why are you leaving racism out as one of the questions, one of the factors leading to inequality?
Yeah, so leading to inequality so there's different ways here that we could look at that question. So both in terms of, so that type of inequality, so horizontal inequality, especially when because it's between groups, will tend to, for people from the dominant group, not want to distribute as much toward the poor of the other group. Okay, so that can be seen perhaps as a form of racism, or in the case of its linguistic group, it's not really racism, but it's dislike of people of the other group. In that sense, also racism can have an effect on how, why we have horizontal inequality. Okay, so here we just start from horizontal inequality. I didn't explain why we have that level of horizontal inequality, but racism can affect why we do have that level of horizontal inequality. Okay?
Can you give an example from another country where it would be racism?
That affects the level of horizontal inequality. I mean, South Africa will have been under the apartheid. That definitely reduced the opportunity of black people to join the economy, and that increased the level of inequality between.
The one that came to my mind was Australia, has an Aboriginal group of people which are very poor, which doesn't put us in very great company, guys. So, explain redistribution in more detail. What would it include? Would it include health insurance for all? I can't quite read that next part, but
Sorry.
Something
No, I
property?
just was trying to understand, you said you used property. So, but what else does it include? Is it, in let's say Sweden or other countries, they give health insurance to everybody. So, what are the other things that go into redistribution?
Yeah. So here redistribution, it can include a lot of things. As you said, it could be public health, it could be public education, it could be things like direct redistribution, so money given to the poor. Like in Canada, which is something we have a lot in Canada, so that the government would give money to the poor directly. So these different kind of programs that are public. Also, other things could be just things like childcare, like. So I'm from the French-speaking part of Canada, of course. Childcare is $7 per day, okay, for everyone. Okay, which is not. I have 2 kids. It's not the case. so that's a form of redistribution.
So
Also.
like a lot of social different.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the kind of social program. Yeah.
So that's why America lags behind so far. Is because of.
So these kind of social program, like education, childcare, public health, and also direct redistribution. So how much you give directly to the poor. Like you will have this kind of program in many countries in which you just give, you try to equalize, and also taxation, how progressive it is. So if taxation is highly progressive, that will tend to reduce net inequality because the rich will have paid more tax, so they will have lower income, and the poor will have paid less. Whereas if you have a case of a flat tax rate, that will tend to that's not progressive. So you will have a case in which a net inequality will actually be fairly high.
So I think this is the last question, and it goes back to the sort of structural issues that we have, like gerrymandering. And this one asks about reducing or eliminating the electoral college. Would that have any effect on our democracy, on equality?
On inequality, I'm not sure really for inequality. It will have perhaps an effect on democracy, or perhaps on the type of policies that are taken, because then it will move toward the left, and we will be more likely. Both we will be more likely to have a Democrat as president, and we will and Republican will move toward the left, because otherwise it will be harder for them to gain office. So we will definitely have a lower level of net inequality after that, because we will have more left-wing kind of policies.
I might want to point out too that the electoral college only has to do with the president. So that if the president was voted by popular demand, that does not mean that the Senate or the House would agree with him. So it sounds wonderful if we had a dictatorship, but we don't, and aren't we happy about that?
Yes. So if there are no more questions, I just want to finish up by saying Thomas Jefferson said, "Knowledge is power." Do you feel more powerful? He said knowledge is safety. I'm hoping